Hi, everybody. This is the Project Management for Collections Managers webinar, and let's get into it. So it's nice to meet you. I am Rachel, and if you're new to webinars or myself, I'm a business owner, author, speaker, educator, advocate, and consultant in the museum and archive space. I specialize in establishing new or re-emerging collection programs. I have more than 15 years experience serving archives, museums, and cultural heritage organizations. And with that extensive experience working with all levels of staff, volunteers, and interns at museum and archive settings. And I'm joined by Nicole Nolan, PMP. Nicole, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, Rachel. I am a certified project management professional. That's what the PMP stands for. I have over a decade of project and program management experience in a whole candy land of different industries, where I've been lucky enough to use that multitasking superpower and learn a lot of different ways to do project and program management and speak a lot of different industry languages. I tend to be a pretty overcommitted volunteer, so I do a lot of different causes and support them both in terms of my professional skills as well as my other interests outside, like the nerdy and vintage wardrobe, where I do a lot of pinup work for fundraisers. And I have my degree in international business and Japanese from Pacific University, which is how Rachel and I know each other, and recently donated my kidney. So I'm a fairly busy individual, and I'm excited to get to sit down and do this seminar.
Excellent. Thank you, Nicole. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get into the actual topic. This session is pre-recorded, and that's so Nicole and I can deliver the maximum amount of information we can and still have a chance to answer any of your follow-up questions as this program progresses. There will be a link to the recording and links to any of the resources we mention that will be sent out via email the following day from the webinar. And as we're going through, there is the chat box in Premiere mode. So if you are joining us for the Premiere, please feel free to share like your own experiences, examples, and resources that you enjoy related to this topic. And then also just please remember that any of the content that either myself or Nicole is presenting is the intellectual property of that particular individual. So just be respectful when you are sharing. And then just a little reminder, YouTube is our main player, and on the bottom right-hand side, which actually I think is this way, mirrored, you have the closed captioning option, and you also have the option for it to go full screen, depending on what sort of screen you're viewing, if you need it larger. And the typical disclaimer that, of course, we are all from very different types and sizes of organizations. And so depending on what type of situation, environment you are in, these strategies may vary. So just apply as appropriate. So for today's agenda, I will lay out why project management for collections managers. So how is this topic applicable for us and how it can help us in our work? Nicole will then share her expertise. She'll go over some project management fundamentals, as well as how to manage a project successfully. And then I'll go ahead and end cap the topic today and talk about how some specific scenarios project management could be applied to our type of work, and of course, what those benefits are. So to get into it, why project management for collections managers is, first of all, a reminder that we are specialists and we have a very deep knowledge on a very specific subject. And there are other specialists out there in the world who have a very deep knowledge on a different subject matter that we could really benefit from. So in this case, we are collection specialists, and we could really benefit from learning from or working with a project management specialist. The other item is that with the right project setup, management, and tools, it can really help save us a lot of project-related headaches, pitfalls, what have you, and it can also help save the organization money, not only from helping to avoid pitfalls, but also helping to ensure that the project is running smoothly, on time, and effectively. So additionally, putting thought and intentionality into our project creation, no matter what sort of project it is, digitizing, collection assessment, putting together an exhibit, any of those types of projects could really benefit from a intentional creation phase. And going through this thought process ahead of time can help alert us to any resources we may need, help us avoid any of those potential pitfalls, and can offer not just you, but your team a more accurate understanding of how long the project will take, and in some cases, how much the project may cost. And then finally, excellent project creation is necessary in areas for grant writing. All of our grant applications, there are usually a project management component where you've got a timeline, project deliverables based on project activities that is required for any successful grant. And it's necessary to complete any project successfully, whether it's grant funded or not. So for all of these reasons and more, this is how project management could really help benefit and support our work so that projects are done accurately and successfully, but also to help us avoid any of those like monetary pitfalls or projects not being able to be completed. So with that in mind, I am going to turn it over to Nicole for her to give us her expertise.
Thank you, Rachel. So let's talk a little bit about project management fundamentals. We're going to talk about the language and what types of projects there are, and also making manageable projects for your organization. So starting with the language, when we talk about a project versus a program, so the highest level we can think of here, a project has a start and an end. A program might encompass multiple projects. So you can think of projects as being activities that you do within a program that have their own defined plans versus the program that might be long running and new things will come in and we'll have people in charge of those projects to get them across the finish line. We'll also talk about the different styles of project management. So when I say agile versus waterfall, for example, a waterfall project is this traditional project management style that is very heavily documented. Some people like to say there's a lot of bureaucracy involved in that because everything has to be documented down to the smallest detail. You have really formal processes and procedures, change requests, and that sort of thing to handle how things work in that project versus an agile project where the whole purpose of that project is to be agile. Change is a part of life. And in an agile project, you are very flexible and you roll with a lot of those changes as they come along. So you have an idea of where this project is going and you have an overall project plan, but you may not be down to the tiniest minutia. And so things will adapt and change as the project goes along. Now, all of those details in the project is your scope. So this is the breadth of what your project covers. And it could be the heavily detailed version in waterfall where you knew everything, or it can be the general outline of this is the scope in the project. And then from there, you would break it down into what's included versus what's not included. When things come into a project that were not part of the original plan, for example, if you were a consultant like Rachel and you had proposed certain items that were part of your project scope, and the client came back and asked for something more, then that would be considered scope creep, where the scope is changing. And so that would be out of scope or scope creep and would require an additional conversation to see where that fits in a project or proposal. The proposal is just like your grant request and your grant proposals, where you are saying, here is how I see your project, and this is all of my scope of work as I see it for this project. And then that approved scope becomes the actual project plan. So we will discuss a little bit further about some more language in terms of what kind of project that you're running, whether you're running in waterfall versus agile, which is what our next subject is on here. So in a waterfall project, you'd have very robust documentation. And in the case of working with government bodies or regulations, or at sometimes certain grant funders, you may have an excessive amount of requirements that you have to meet and a certain level of documentation that you have to meet. So you might feel like waterfall is your only choice because of the level of detail that you have to go in to get something done. And sometimes that may be the case. With agile, maybe you get to move things a little bit more smoother in smaller chunks as you find things and with a little bit less definition. And in the agile space, you can run things that are called either a Kanban or a sprint, and you would run them on a board. And so we'll talk a little bit about those in terms of tools in one of our next sections. But with Agile, it might seem nebulous, a little broad in terms of how that's going to work. And the reality is, as much as an Agilist and a traditionally trained project manager might seem like they're at opposite ends of the spectrum, like most things in the world, the reality is the way that you work with a project is going to be somewhere in the middle. And that's really going to depend on your organization and their needs and the kind of people that you work with and the kind of grants or programs that you work with. And that really leads us over to those making manageable projects bullet point. So a manageable project for your team would really depend on the outside requirements that are out of your control. So when you have those grant requirements and reporting requirements, those are going to be things that you're going to need to make sure are included. And you have to know what leads up to those so that you always meet your milestones, essentially, which is another vocabulary word that says this is a date and a specific deliverable that we have to hit. And a lot of the times your grants will say, for example, with the service dog organization that I work with, you must place 5 dogs during the grant period. And so every time we place a dog, we're able to bill for some of that. And we have to provide the information that says this is the dog, this was where they went, this was how they were trained, and these were all of the expenses associated with it, so that we have met that milestone for the grant. So you could have multiple grants for a project, and so you would need to be tracking what all of those different requirements are to make sure that your reporting has effectively covered all of your milestones that you need up until that point for your grant billing, so that you still manage to get that same grant again next year, because of course we want you to keep your funding. It's the same thing outside of the nonprofit world, where you want to make sure you keep your clients. So you have to make sure that you meet those deadlines, no matter what industry that you are in. Your grant requirements are a good component of building that manageable project, but it also is how you as an organization work internally. So, for example, working with Rachel, I was able to look at how she writes out her proposals for projects for working with different organizations and how that's standardized. And standardization of things like that will make working and building your project much easier, because we can help you build into like bite-sized chunks that are clearly defined pieces of work, which ideally you can then repeat that same process in another project because you've already got the structure built. I do suggest that you do somewhere in the middle of that sort of hybridization between waterfall, so that you meet all of any of your regulatory or funding requirements, but so that you keep change as a possibility on the agile side of things. And so we're going to talk more on the next slide about all the different pieces that kind of go into that and how you can make that really work for your organization. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit more about managing those successful projects. A few years ago, it would have been terrible to suggest that you had some sort of a hybrid structure between agile and waterfall. But the reality is that that's pretty much where most of us are. None of us are really well defined in one specific box. And so doing projects, it's really important to make sure that you work through this and understand what the needs are for your specific organization and finding the tools and the processes that will work for you, because the goal is to make it repeatable, save you time and save you money and make things go faster. So as I mentioned earlier on, scope and scope creep are going to be some of your biggest things. Understanding what your scope is, what's included and what is not included, and being able to have the conversation when something comes up that shouldn't be included, or maybe it was a requirement that was missed and you need to reevaluate what that means for your project. That's where scope is going to really define your entire project in terms of what it's going to take. You have to have really clear communication. So having those conversations with what we'll call stakeholders in a nonprofit, that might be your board members, it might be your funders. They're essentially all the people that have a piece of that project or need to be aware of that project. They might also be, for example, your sponsor for the project, that's going to be the person to unstick things when things get hard. So knowing who your stakeholders are, how to manage the communication, and how to effectively communicate your milestones are going to be extremely important. Those metrics and milestones are things that you can pull with project management tools and technologies, which we'll get to here shortly, but understanding what the success metrics are and what the required milestones are, and making sure that everyone is aware of those and that you have regular meetings and check-ins to understand that this is how we're going to get there, and that the red flag gets raised sooner rather than later so that you can address things and get ahead of them is key. And in order to do that, one of the things that Agile, or the Scrum is another section within Agile, does is you have daily stand-ups. And really the intention is that you stand up. You stand up for 10 minutes, you get everybody in the room, either virtually or in person, and you go through everyone's responsibilities, where things are at, whether or not somebody needs support, and whether there's an issue or a blocker that needs to be raised. And you do it every day, just 10 minutes for each project team. And that really helps you keep that in the room communication so that hopefully things are found faster and move more smoothly. Getting through those metrics and those milestones and thinking that you've met all of them means that you have to get to the definition of done. Definition of done says this is what it means for the project to be done and closed out. With grants, you usually have a final report of some kind, and that's kind of a project closeout, essentially. And so whether you're doing that for the grant or whether you're doing that for your organization, you are able to look at your definition of done and say, I did all of these things. Here were the results. The package is done, finished, project is out, and you have essentially completed the puzzle. Project managers are ultimately facilitators and puzzle masters. Our goal is to work with experts like you and help you get to completion. We're not the expert in that. We're the expert in the process to get you done. So that definition of done will be the last little bit of your project and your project plan so that you know what you're delivering. In software, those are acceptance criteria. So you might hear someone mention that as well. And it says, this is what it means for this item to be completed. The tools that we use for a lot of this is like, well, stand-up meetings. There's always meetings. We try to avoid them, but you're always going to have meetings. We recommend those 10 minutes and getting through smoothly, and having someone like an Agile coach or Agile project manager get you set up with those so that you understand how they run, and so that you can really do them 10 minutes so that things don't expand and expand and expand, because you don't want people standing in meetings. The tools that we use virtually for running projects and for also giving us something to look at for those meetings are softwares, some of which are free. The most standard one that everyone knows of is called Jira. It's part of Atlassian, and it basically creates a big virtual board for you that has Post-it notes on it. So you would break down your work in these cards, or that are the virtual Post-it notes, and say, we have this item, which is called a story, and underneath that, we have these items that have to be completed before this section is done. And you're able to assign them to people, and you can look at it on a screen or on a board together and say, okay, this is where this is at. It can have time tracking on it. It can have documents attached to it. It can have a deadline attached to it, and you can watch it move through the process from to do to in progress to, oh, it's on hold, or oh, it's under review, to done. And then you move on to the next thing. So all of your project breakdown that you created that says, here's my scope of work, gets translated into these virtual Post-it notes that you then get to move through the process so that you can visualize this and see where everything is at. You're also able to use those kind of tools to then pull metrics that says, well, how much time are these things taking? Have we put time on things? So you can use it to run time tracking reporting so that you can use that for your billing purposes. And you can also look back at those reports and say, I'm doing a similar project. How many hours did we spend on this? So that it can inform your estimating and proposals so that you're more successful in your proposals. In addition to something like Jira, which can be very expensive, there's a lot of free softwares, as I mentioned, like Trello and Asana. And the one that ultimately we selected for Rachel is one called ClickUp. And they have paid versions that give additional reporting, but they really do offer a free version with a lot of capabilities where you can build out these projects for your organization or for a client if you're a consultant. And once you have your structure in place, you have the opportunity that you can copy these structures into a new project. And then you've got all of your bones together and you just have to update it for that client. And so you get a lot faster of being able to transition things through. And it just helps you with that visualization of work and having a document repository all in one place, and your time tracking and your estimates versus your actual times. And it really gives you those at a glance visuals within easily an hour, maybe two, of getting the training in place for some of these tools. So it's definitely recommended that you get those visual Kanban boards. Essentially, Kanban is a Japanese word, and that was coined by Toyota. And so that's the system of moving work through the process. And that's what the visual board is, with all of the Post-its on it. And the last thing I have on here, italicized, highlighted for a reason, is people. So investing in your people, having the right people, using the right people, knowing the right people, all of those are going to be extremely important for a successful project. Being able to upskill and train your people. We'll have some referrals a little bit down later for resources for that sort of a thing, and just utilizing their skills. The people that you have on your projects and understanding where they fit in that, and having them skilled enough to manage those projects. You can do that so well with the people in your organization with just a little bit of work. And so I highly recommend that you talk to your people, see what they like to do, see what they've done in the past that you may not know about, and utilize those people as best you can, because your people are absolutely going to be your greatest resource, and they're the most major requirement for a successful project.
Thank you, Nicole. I love the people part at the end, because that, of course, is so critical in all of our work and can sometimes be easy to forget about when we're thinking about timelines and structure. And so having people as a resource too is definitely important to think about. So thank you for that emphasis. All right, so to bring it back to collections management a little bit in terms of application, this can be helpful for like specific projects, but also if you have certain tasks that are day-to-day management or day-to-day operations. So thinking about it in terms of task management, or as Nicole said, a repeatable process management, are two different areas where I think could really help in our collections work. And to highlight the task management piece for just a moment further with you, thinking about archives and museums and how much we can sometimes rely on volunteers and interns who may be coming in at different times, or staff that may be doing activities at different times, and yet it all working together towards a common goal. Using a project management tool, or at least some of these project management principles, can be incredibly helpful to everybody who is on your team to figure out, okay, where did so-and-so leave off? Where did I leave off? What's next up for me? How is this working towards the goal? How are we doing with this? Can be so helpful when you've got sort of a hybrid team like that. And then for that project-based, of course, Nicole did a great job articulating how, of course, project management is so incredibly necessary for successful project execution. And in my own experience and in working with clients, this has become incredibly necessary, especially in the area of digital collections work. So thinking about all of the steps that need to happen, from item preparation to digitization, file management, research, metadata creation to publication, there are a lot of very technical steps that need to happen, guidelines that need to be followed, things that need to happen before another thing can happen, or maybe they could happen concurrently. So those are a lot of mechanisms in place that project management and the principles could really help you with that. And especially so if you're working in a hybrid team situation on a project like that. And then, of course, as Nicole and I have both indicated, grant projects, and especially if they're for a large amount or maybe federal funding, there's regulations that come with that. And you are responsible ultimately for making sure that you meet those commitments based on the outline of the grant, the specificity of what the money is supposed to be used for, the ultimate outcome that you're supposed to achieve. So having a project management tool and having some of those principles in place for you and your team can make all of that much easier for you to be successful in. And then, as Nicole indicated, like once you have some of these built out, it is so easy to then replicate these for any future similar projects. So if this is a new idea and a new tool for you, just know that while it may take you some time to learn it and learn how to implement it in your particular scenario in a way that makes sense, once you do that initial time investment, it will ultimately save you a ton of time later on in future projects. So that's all to say. I very much encourage you spending some time, especially if you have hybrid team situations, and especially if you're doing projects that have multiple moving pieces. This is certainly an area that I think it's worth your time and investment in. And then for some of the benefits, whether this is helpful for you to hear, or if you need to take it to your boss or board or whomever you may need to convince to provide permission for or investment in a project management tool or even a project manager person, this slide is for you to help you with that. So in terms of benefits in using project management principles, using project management tool, or even working with a project management specialist, is that there's savers happening. So you have that ultimate time saver, especially once you get that project or process set up. You can then do that replication. You can also save time because you're avoiding some of those pitfalls. And it saves money. So it saves money because your project is done in the most efficient way possible. You're identifying those pitfalls ahead of time to circumnavigate. And ultimately, in getting those projects done and in having good project management principles in place, you can get more grant funding in. So it saves money, but also means you could get more money. In terms of supports, it helps support best practices. So, for example, if it's a digitization project, there are multiple best practices depending on which area of the project you are in that need to be adhered to. And having that project management board set up and being able to assign specific details, resource links, document sharing of where the guidelines may be, having that in place is all in support of best practices being applied where they're supposed to. This also helps, of course, with consistency. So if it is more than just you working on a particular project, having this in place also helps to ensure consistency across your team and as it applies to your project. This all helps, of course, to then benefit that quality of work. So if all of you are being consistent, if you have access and ready reference to your best practices, that means that ultimately the quality of work being produced is going to be higher and consistent quality. And then, of course, project management is all about helping to meet the goals, milestones, the commitments you've made, maybe the regulations you need to adhere to. So having this in place is all in support of you being able to meet those. And it prevents stuff. So having good project management principles in place helps prevent any sort of stumbling blocks for you, and especially so if it's part of this larger project, which can unfortunately cause a cascade of stumbling blocks if not being able to be handled immediately. It also helps prevent any project downtime. So having that regular communication, having that central place where the project management is happening, all helps prevent downtime between like, oh, where did we leave off on that? Somebody doesn't know what they're supposed to be doing, or they're not aware of the timeline. So it prevents any of those like timeline breakdowns. It also prevents mistakes, and specifically expensive mistakes, and using especially that digitization project example, because that does tend to be one of our more expensive types of projects. Having this project management piece in place will help you to avoid mistakes with dollar signs attached to them. And of course, headaches. Once you have this up and running, and of course, as I have found in my business now, thanks to Nicole helping and advise us setting our project management practices in place, it has not only done all of the other items that we've outlined here, but it has saved me many headaches in terms of trying to make sure things are happening correctly, trying to keep tabs on multiple different projects happening, different team members, that kind of thing. So if you're one of those people who is sort of the connection point among different teams, different projects, what have you, having a project management tool and knowing some of those project management principles is such a lifesaver for you and is well worth the investment of your time to know and use those things, especially if you're responsible for several different people and several different projects. And with that, we do have a couple of resources of some of the different tools Nicole mentioned earlier. ClickUp is one of the more robust tools that we found together, well, specifically Nicole found, and my company is using, and has a great robust different tools and options for the free subscription. And then you can also, of course, depending on your needs, scale up to different paid versions. So it's a freemium model. For most of my clients, the free version is robust enough for you that I don't think you necessarily need to invest in a subscription. And so with that in mind, I definitely recommend you take a look at ClickUp. And then Nicole, please tell us about PMI.
Sure. So the PMP certification that I have is an international certification, and the Project Management Institute is the organization that handles that, both for my waterfall-based certification and the Agile certified professional I'll get later this year. And there's project associate levels and all the way up into program and portfolio managers as you go up the scale as well. And it's all heavily based on the amount of experience you have in the industry, as well as the coursework you take and the very difficult exam that you take. So finding anyone with any of the certifications from PMI will give you a really solid base as a consultant to help you build these processes. But you also have the opportunity at PMI to get literature, articles. There are some free coursework that you can do virtually. There are some paid gatherings that you can do together. Your local chapters for the organization, since they're all over the place, will have chapter meetings that generally include educational opportunities and a dinner. So, for like $30, you'll get 2 or 3 hours of education and a sit-down meal. Or there can be networking opportunities where you can meet people within this industry and people within this profession in a variety of industries to sort of gain more knowledge that way as well in different places. So I highly recommend giving PMI a look as a whole, and also finding your local chapter to see if there's opportunities there to start exploring it. Certification is certainly a great option for folks, and you might be surprised at just how relevant the experience that you already have is towards certification. I didn't even realize that project management was the direction that I was in until someone mentioned getting a certification. And when I looked it up, I went, oh, I've been like the project manager since I was a teenager, because that was my default mode of working. So you may find that you are already qualified and just need to take the formal coursework for it and sit for the exam. So there's opportunities there to discuss with your team or with your employer to see if funding's available to have that covered within your organization as well. And most of us that are involved in things like PMI, or that are clearly posting that we are PMPs or anything like that on our profile, we're generally happy to talk about the experience, to send resources your way, to suggest opportunities for connection, because we want to help other people succeed as well.
Thank you for sharing that, Nicole. And I just want to asterisk this for people watching, that this is an excellent area to consider for professional development, as you indicated. Not only because I think the people who tend to find themselves in museums and archives are sort of naturally inclined towards organization and project management, but also because you can take the skill no matter where you go. So like it will immediately be helpful to you in your place of work, but then it will also be of benefit to you as a skill you can take with you and be appealing to future job opportunities, whether still in a collections management area or outside of the industry too. So just want to highlight that for people, that it would be a great area of professional development if you want to stay in the museum or archives, or if you want to leave museum and archives.
Absolutely. Like I said in the beginning, with my Candyland of experience, I've been in high-tech manufacturing, hospitality, automotive dealer services, retail, now in athletic wear, like very much all across the board. And it is those project management skills and program management skills that are highly transferable.
So just a note of connection, and then we'll get to the questions portion. If you already know and are connected to me, then this is, you are already connected. If not, if I'm new to you, these are all the different places you can connect. Specifically, if this is the first webinar you've attended or seen and you're interested in future webinars, definitely checking out and signing up for the newsletter link at the bottom. All of the webinars and offerings I do are first sent to that list, and so you'll be the first to know for any future offerings. And then, of course, to connect with Nicole, you can find her on LinkedIn, linkedin.com, and then just Nicole Nolan. And this link will be provided in the email after this webinar. And then Nicole will answer some questions, of course, in the chat for the next few moments with our colleagues here. I did have a couple questions that came up for me, though,
Sure.
that I would love to ask while we have you. In thinking about organizations, especially museums and archives who may have never hired a project manager before, where can they find project managers? And if they can't hire one full time, like what are some of the other options that might be available?
Sure. So those networking events and opportunities that I talked about with the Project Management Institute in different chapters around the area, there's usually a section where they come up with, you can stand up and say that you have an opportunity or that you're looking for an opportunity. And LinkedIn is definitely a great resource because most of them will also have groups on LinkedIn. And if you can reach out to someone there and say, this is what I'm looking for, they can spread it around and you'll find opportunities for anyone that's willing to consult. So looking for a consultant that's willing to take something on and just having them provide a proposal for you based on the kind of services that you're looking for is probably the easiest way. And depending on how that goes, hiring a project or a program manager can certainly be an opportunity if you have enough bandwidth for that or the funding for that. It is a fairly high level role. And so making sure that you do your research into what it means to have someone who is certified on your team and what that expense would be like is certainly important. And in the interim, while you can't, I definitely recommend finding one of who's willing to consult for you.
I have found, and perhaps Nicole, you could speak a little bit more to this too, um, even just having somebody help you think through how you could set up a project,
Mhm.
even if you can't have that person like at all the stand-ups, etc. But just even having like access to a person and getting like a good foundation. Does that sound like it would be a reasonable option? Like a happy compromise if you can't afford your own forever.
Yes, absolutely. Essentially, you'd be creating the scope of what you needed for that consultant, as we mentioned before, having them go through the basics with you, having them train up your necessary people, having them make sure that your systems and tools and processes are all set up and that you've selected the right tool for you, and then having them get those initial meetings worked out with you, maybe sit in on a couple of those to help you run through those, and then handing it off. That's definitely going to be your most cost-effective way of getting your project management set up if you're not prepared to have a full-time person on staff, would be to bring in that consultant and say, here, get us ramped up and let us run with it. And then generally they'll allow themselves to be available if you need additional training, if you have additional questions, or if you have new people that you need to onboard and you don't feel comfortable yet training them yourself.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And that it pretty much is precisely how Nicole is consulted with our company in helping us assess, first of all, like what are the options out there tools wise, and helping us select one that made sense for us. And then also helped us like learn not only like crash course in project management principles, but also how do you use ClickUp? Like there are a couple different options on the style of use, as Nicole indicated. And so really helping us think through not just what tool makes sense, but also how does setting up a project make sense, and the different tools that we could use that would actually help save us time or help us leverage what we have in there. So I definitely recommend, if you can't afford one like full-time forever, even just bringing one in for some of that initial consulting and like periodic check-ins is so valuable. So thank you for helping to outline what that could look like.
Yes, absolutely. And I will say it's more than just technology or digital projects. Like, let's say you have a massive fundraiser event or multiple days for your anniversary or something like that. And you've got all these different departments that you have to work with and different vendors and different deadlines and timelines, and whether you're getting funding and donations, or maybe there's a funding plan that goes along with it for fundraising. Those are all the kind of things that you can outline out as a project as well and still have that same visibility using those boards and those essential digital Post-it notes that you can assign to all the different people, and you'd be able to look at it at a glance to know where things are. So it's really broad how this can work for your organization.
Mhm. And then my last question for you, Nicole, is for especially organizations in non very populated areas can sometimes mean that there's a museum or an archive that there's like one staff person.
Mhm.
Sometimes there's a team of volunteers, sometimes not. In those scenarios where it's just you, does it make sense to still use a project management tool? Like, what are your thoughts on that when it's kind of just you for most of it?
I do think that it's still a really useful organizational tool, and it's worth the investment, because one of the things that it does, especially having everything visual and available, is if you find yourself with the opportunity to bring somebody on, or you've got a volunteer that you can train up, or an emergency happens and a board member needs to step in, everything is available. It's all there. And training somebody up on that can be a very quick process to get them up to speed. So just for your own sanity, in a way, of having everything at a glance, instead of being like, oh, well, I need to go to this calendar or this document repository or this site and this site and this site, and just being able to look at it and say, okay, here's everything that's in flight for the different projects and programs that we're running, and just be able to go, oh, here's a page with a report and it shows me who's assigned to what and where everything is at, and I have a deadline coming up or something's overdue. It's just a lot cleaner having it all in one space.
Hmm. I didn't even think about like that continuity of care benefit too. I
Mhm.
was definitely like, yes, of course, that it helps the individual, but also like if something happens, like people will be able to continue to care and manage the collections while you are gone. So,
It's one of the biggest things about repeatable processes and standardization is the ability to hand things off.
mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Nicole. For this premiere, we'll stay on for a few more minutes in the chat as you have questions. If for some reason you can't access the chat, you can always send me an email and we can pop it in the chat and answer it.
Mhm.
If you're watching this webinar and it's already past the premiere, you can, of course, follow up via email with me if you have any questions. And Nicole, just thank you again so much for your time and for sharing your expertise with us today.
Yes, thanks. It's been quite enjoyable.